Be thou the rainbow in the storms of life, the evening beam that smiles the clouds away and tints tomorrow with prophetic ray. That is Lord Byron's The Bride Abide Us. So welcome to Stories in Colour, a podcast from the National Gallery in London, searching for the histories of how colour has changed the world. And today it's our final episode of this very first series. Thank you so much for joining us, and do make sure that you're subscribed so you don't miss any updates on what's next for the podcast. Today we're heading somewhere over the rainbow to look at how this highly symbolic natural phenomenon is seen, both scientifically and in culture. From ancient mythologies, rainbows have drawn together the worlds of man and the gods, and in contemporary cultures symbolise peace, prosperity and inclusion. I'm Beks Leary from the digital department here at the National Gallery, and I'm joined today by Dr Alexandra Loske from Brighton Museums and Joe Padfield from our scientific department. Alexandra is a colour expert and art historian who is currently curator of the Royal Pavilion in Brighton. Her exhibition, Colour, a Chromatic Promenade through the Royal Pavilion, is on display until October 2025. So if you're listening, as this goes out, you can go and check that out. And she's also author of The Artist's Palette and Colour, a Visual History. Joseph's a principal scientist here at the National Gallery. He brings a wealth of expertise across multiple domains, including data management, digital infrastructure, conservation documentation, digital imaging, web development, preventative conservation, museum lighting, colour science, and the technical examination of paintings. Huge welcome, both of you. Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode as we get into all things rainbows. Joe, I'll start with you. What is a rainbow? Tell us.
Well, a rainbow is a visual representation of the colours that are in light. So we often see light coming from the sun and it's white or slightly different colours depending on the time of day. But the rainbow represents the mixture of different types of colours that you can see in the light when that light is actually split up into its component parts. So effectively, if you are standing with the rain in front of you and the sunlight low behind you in the sky, the light can go across and then hit all the little raindrops. And the light is then bent by the raindrops, and the different colours are slowly spread out. They're dispersed by the physics of how the light interacts with the water. And the whole colour of the rainbows are spread out and slowly expand. And then you can see that rainbow in the sky. Beautiful.
And so it's important about exactly where you're stood.
Yes, it's all to do with the angles of the light and where the sun relative is. But it's if you are standing in the right position, you will see a rainbow. And that the best position is with the sun behind you, sort of maybe early morning, sort of late afternoon, and shining past you at water in the sky. So it can be mist, it can be rain, it can be drizzle, but it's effectively the water in the sky that the light can then react with.
And I guess when we see pictures of rainbows, I don't know, as a child might draw them, you get the kind of the stripes of the colours.
Yeah.
But that's not exactly what we're seeing when we see
No, not
in
technically.
The sky.
It's a constant, a continuous spectrum of all of the colours. So the light you see is dependent on what's called the wavelength of the colour. So it's how the light actually moves through reality. And the different wavelengths that you have you get different colours. And effectively that is a continuous spectrum of shifting wavelengths from red through to ultraviolet and beyond. And we sort of psychologically see these colours because we've learned we see 7 colours in the rainbow, so that's what we see. But they are the names that are given to some of the key points in the spectrum. But technically, if you look really closely, it's continuous. You can see lots of different sections.
Amazing. Alexandra, Joe just touched on this kind of 7 colours that we give names to in the rainbow. Could you tell us what those are and sort of how we've ended up there?
Well, I blame Isaac Newton, who in 1704 published, after many decades of being fascinated, interested in light and optics, he published his experiments in a very big book called Optics. And of course, from that, we get one of the most iconic and important sort of diagrams in modern history, and that is, of course, the first of colour, not the first, but the first of widely disseminated and known colour wheel or colour circle, where, and this is based on this experiment of shining pure light, white light, in a darkened environment through a three-sided prism. And correct me if I'm wrong. I hope I'm just explaining this correctly. And then, of course, what comes out is that visible range of rainbow colours. And by turning this into a diagram and giving it sort of divisions into 7 colours, we end up with this, understanding of 7 colours in a rainbow. And they were red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And this has remained, of course. This is, I understand in English, it's the Richard of York gave battle in vain, memorising it. And of course, as Joe just said, it's not quite right, because there are no divisions in the rainbow or the visible spectrum. There are no lines going through it.
There's some other memory techniques, aren't there, Joe? Do you want to tell us?
I've always remembered it's Roy G. Biv, as in someone's name. So it's the initials of each one. But I did read recently one I quite like, which is rainbows often yield great, big, impressive views.
Oh, that's lovely.
Which is kind of appropriate for looking at paintings. But there's lots of them. There are some which are less broadcastable and various other things. But it's a range. People use just the initials or the feeling of these things. There are kids' songs. There are lots of different things people use to remember the rainbow.
If it's this spectrum of visible, like why did he come up with 7? Why are there 7 colours in the rainbow?
Well, there's a number of reasons. I think he was trying to find a sort of geometric or visual representation of a colour order or colour system, or let's call it colour theory. And turning that into a wheel is interesting, or a circle. But dividing it into 7, he believed in the analogy of music and colour, or sound and colour. So it resembles the musical scales, but there's also other analogies, like with the planets.
And days of the week, there's quite a few different 7s.
Yeah.
So 7 notes in the musical scale, 7 days of the week. Maybe 7 days of creation. I don't know if that comes into it as well. And
it's just linking to what was important at the time.
Yeah.
That was an important number, and it gave gravitas, as it were, to the theory that he was putting forward.
And originally indigo wasn't there? It started with 6?
Well, Newton had several ideas about how many colours there should be. And when he draws the colour segment, which, by the way, is a tiny little image in a very big book, and you have to sort of fold it out. It's such an important diagram, but it's very small in the book. But so important. In the blue range, in the short wavelength, on the shorter wavelength side, we have indigo next to blue. And of course, indigo, it's not just a colour, it's also a dye stuff. So something you colour things with. And of course, indigo from the indigofera plant, which was basically overtaking the woad industry at the time, being imported from India, that was big business, quite literally big business at the time. So the indigo question, the indigo trade was very much a topic at the time. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's there. And of course, later on, other writers and philosophers and colour theorists develop theories that are more useful for people not working with light, but with material colours, so pigments and paints and dye stuff. And then things change. Because, as you say, Joe, when you mix, when you combine all these colours of the Newtonian rainbow, you come back to white light. So you can't split them any further. But when you do the same with your paint box, the colours in your paint box, you don't get white. You get the opposite. You get a very muddy brown, dark greys into black.
Yes.
And painters realised that, or artists who dealt with illustrating things, especially illustrating so books on natural history, the world around us, they realised Newton was great, but not always applicable or always useful for the art of painting.
Because that was part of his, I think it was part of his experiment, is that Newton actually shone the light through 2 prisms. Because initially, I think previous scientists believed that the colours came from mixing sort of white and black, or however that works. But effectively, by splitting the colour up and then separating the colour out by positioning another prism, he wasn't able to split up the red light further. It just came out red again. And that demonstrated the notion that the colours were in the white light to begin with, rather than being added by the prism.
It kind of blows your mind, doesn't it? Because, I don't know, when you're playing with white paint, it's going to act so differently.
It's very different.
It's weird to try and remember it.
Yeah.
The easier one to think of is if you're seeing light, it's everything hits you to be white. Whereas if you're looking at colours, what you're seeing is actually the light that's reflected back. Yes. So if you absorb all of the light in a brown-black thing, you don't get as much reflected back. So it's to do with the additive and subtractive mixing. Yeah. But I always end up getting it mixed up in my head. No pun intended.
And a lot of writers did. So until, well into the 19th century, you can still see these sort of uncertainties. And even amongst the great, great writers on colour, you say, they're not quite clear about what is what. But it's all fascinating.
So fascinating. You can go all the way back to Aristotle, who, is one of those who thought that all colours came from white and black and linked it to the 4 elements, didn't he? Earth, air, wind and fire. So Isaac Newton definitely game-changing here. And there's a popular culture image of the prism that people might be familiar with or might not, so we'll quickly describe it. But it's the album cover of The Dark Side of the Moon by the band Pink Floyd from March 1973, and it was designed by the British design studio Hypnosis. The designer was George Hardy. So the album cover has a black background. It has a kind of white outlined triangle, a angled beam of kind of graphic white light, illustrative, and then a series of colours coming out the other side. And it's not quite Newtonian, is it?
It's given the idea of light being bent. I mean, I think that's the issue, is that the reason you get the rainbow is that when light moves from one material to another, there's a physical term called the refractive index. It's to do with how light bends and moves through a material. But if you go from one material to another material, effectively the different wavelengths are bent slightly differently. So the red is bent less than all of the other colours, and that's why you start to get the rainbow out. So in this album cover, you've got that very nice idea of the white light coming upwards and then the rainbow angled slightly downwards as it's coming out, to give you that idea of the bend of the light.
But there's one colour
missing.
Yes, I've got beef with this. No, I think it's wonderful. It's wonderful that this sort of continued, and also it is very relatable because it is in living memory, and Pink Floyd is still around, some of them. So it is simplifying a tremendously important point in modern scientific history, but it's turning into pop culture. And they also simplified themselves because I think Hypnosis had done several covers for Pink Floyd, full of detail. This sort of late 60s, early 70s, very, very detailed, figurative album covers. And this is almost completely geometric. This is almost abstract in certain aspects. And what comes out is 6 colours, not 7.
Which one did they miss?
So clearly indigo is not there. Indigo has dropped off the list, as it did quite soon after Newton, in fact. But it still has the visual impact, of course. And there's other allusions, such as to the pyramids, the Egyptian pyramids, which are, I think, in the gatefold or on the back of the album cover. And it's tremendously effective, I think.
Yes, it's meant to represent their sort of light shows at their gigs and a spectrum of madness and existentialism.
I think it would also be that if you tried to put 7 colours in a rainbow that is graphically represented like that, you'd just end up with a broader looking blue bit, which would be weird.
Is that optical mixing?
Well, it's just, I think just the simple nature of it is that indigo going into violet, if you're looking at it from a distance, there's not a huge jump, there's not a huge shift.
Less contrast.
So if it's a simple print or print representation, if people just looked at it quickly, it would just appear like there's a thicker blue bit to it, unless you're looking at it carefully. So that might be why sort of playing with the cleanness of the image as well.
It is an extraordinarily clean image, very effective, and clearly very relatable. And I use it a lot in lectures because people then suddenly realise how important it was. But also it continues. Of course, it was a gatefold album, and the analogy to music and sound continues because the spectrum turns into sound waves. So cool. I think it's the heartbeat, isn't it? So it's it's a great piece of pop culture.
Music's quite nice too.
Yeah. And the music's great.
Let's head back in time a bit now to how painters have reimagined or responded to theories around colour and rainbows. So Angelica Kaufmann was an artist working in the late 18th century, and she did a commission for the Royal Academy of Arts here in London. How was a part of that commission a response to Newton, Alexandra?
Well, Kaufmann, working in the late 18th century, meant she was sort of at the heart, and she was here in London for 15 years, although originally from Austria. German-speaking areas. And there were lots of discussions going on about colour. Is colour valuable? Should it be taught? Because, people like Reynolds, the first president of the Royal Academy, was still saying, desenyo or drawing or, outline is much, much more important than garish colour. But colour was coming into its own for various reasons. Lots of people talking about it, writing about it. And Kaufmann taps into that and sort of elevates colour to the same level as composition and invention, so the other elements of the arts. But essentially, that ceiling roundel is an allegory. So here is a woman representing colour or painting in general.
So titled Colouring. It's was produced in 1778 to 80.
Yeah.
And let me describe it a little. It was a commission that eventually ended up on the ceiling, didn't it, of the new council room. The Royal Academy was then in Somerset House. Each of the roundels represented elements of art. So this painting shows a woman sitting down on a grassy ledge with mountainous landscape and a bright blue sky behind her. And she's wearing flowing white robes, ochre and red, in different aspects of her kind of flowing clothing. And she holds a paint palette and paintbrushes in her left hand, and in her right hand she holds another paintbrush up above her head, and she is sort of stealing or dipping some pigment from the rainbow which arches across the sky above her and she looks up to. And at her feet is another very sweet little detail, which is the little chameleon. And there's a nice little connection to the National Gallery. So when the Royal Academy moved to Trafalgar Square, they shared part of our building. So part of the building that you would now visit as the National Gallery. And from records, there appears to be mentions of this ceiling painting being displayed in our own Wilkins building. But today you can see this painting on free display in the front hall of the Royal Academy on Piccadilly in London. Alexandra, you...
And it's very lovely because it now hangs a lot lower than originally in Somerset House. So you can get really close to
see it.
Yes, so it's wonderful because of the four roundels, which forms the elements of art and painting, colour or colouring is the most active one. There's a lot happening. And part of it goes back to the allegorical representation of painting and colour based on Cesare Ripa's book, Iconologia of icons, basically. So we have a female sort of allegory of colour with some of the attributes you would expect, like a palette, like a sort of very colourful outfit, and she's sort of falling out of her dress, and her hair's a little bit unkempt, and that is apparently a sign of creativity. But the key thing here is Kaufmann includes a rainbow. I think it's an Etonian rainbow, and of course that was being discussed at the time. So throughout the 18th century, Newton was being discussed, and also the shortcomings for artists, as I mentioned, it's marrying physical colour with the colours of the rainbow, with immaterial colour. What does that mean for a painter? And I think what Kaufmann is doing here is she's sort of recognising, okay, this discussion is going on, and for a painter it means something different, and every painter who wants attempts to depict a rainbow has that problem of painting something ephemeral, immaterial, in thick, in this case, oil colours. And how do you do that? She's done pretty well, I think. It looks
good.
quite transparent. But it's that lovely sort of joyful dipping into Newton's rainbow and then putting it on the palette. There's nothing much on the palette yet. So she's taking perhaps inspiration from Newton and acknowledging that sort of discourse that was going on. And later on, of course, she befriends Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, one of the great colour theorists, who publishes in the very late 18th and early 19th century. So it's a fabulous, joyful take on chromatic, discussions at the time.
Talking about rainbows in relation to creativity, Jo, you mentioned there was a computer in the 80s that kind of linked the two as well.
Definitely tells my age. Yeah, the ZX Spectrum, which was one of the first home computers that people could buy and have at home to play very simple computer games on. It was the emblem they had for the ZX Spectrum was a depiction of a rainbow. And the big issue is this was one of the first sort of home computers where you could have color in the computer games rather than just a black and white thing. So it was iconography at the time to depict that we have a color computer, you can buy the color computer and there's color in it. So it was a big sort of push, but it became a very nicely well-known symbol for that, the digital development of what you could do with computers at the time. So it's a memory I have because I did have a ZX Spectrum and various other small computers at the time. And it was a big deal.
Wasn't the original Apple logo as well? Wasn't that striped with colour? I don't know if that was a rainbow.
Yes, there was some colour stripes in it.
Is it no longer?
It changed.
They've
Google is
stripped it
just
back,
changing
haven't
their emblem. They've got a very colourful G.
Yeah.
They're just changing it now. But it's the ZX Spectrum was one of the first home computers that gave you colour. So that they kind of made sense there in that.
Totally. Now feels like a good time for us to take a break. Thank you so much for talking us through what rainbows are. And we've started talking a little bit about how designers and artists have represented them. After the break, we're going to look a little bit more at some contemporary artists, and then we're going to go all the way back to ancient cultures, ancient mythologies, and what rainbows have meant through history. So we'll see you after the break. So welcome back from the break, and we are going to dive into some more contemporary artists who've worked with and of rainbows. Alexandra, could you talk us a bit about Olafur Eliasson?
Oh, I love his work. Of course, some of you might remember the wonderful sun installation, the weather project in the Tate.
Yes, in the Turbine Hall.
Turbine Hall, wasn't it, where he created an atmosphere? I mean, there's not a lot of difference between sun imagery and rainbow imagery, of course. But he also created something on top of a building, so totally immersive. It's absolutely wonderful, on top of the Aarhus Museum in Denmark. And you basically walk through a rainbow, and I think it's called Your Rainbow Walkway or panorama.
Panorama, yes.
So it's a circle, which I love. So it's a circle on a square building, and you walk through the rainbow spectrum without lines dividing it, which is great. So he's both Newtonian and sort of slightly sort of improving on Newton, and it's wonderful because it encourages it's very contemporary because it encourages, of course, taking pictures and selfies and then taking it to another medium, putting it on social media streams. So I think it's a wonderful contemporary take on the idea of immersing yourself in immaterial rainbow colours.
And any other favourites of yours?
So early on, Andy Goldsworthy was standing in the 1980s. I think he was standing in a little stream and creating rainbows by just splashing water in when there was bright sunlight at the right time of the day. So it required considerable knowledge about how rainbows appear, how they are created. So
was that captured at all, or was the artwork the live performance of?
I think it was both. I think there's images of him, but as usual with Goldsworthy, it's transitory and
yes.
but it was more of a performance, I guess, but there are pictures of it. And then very recently, a Japanese photographer, Hiroshi Sugimoto, has created a whole series of photographs called optics. So after Isaac Newton, and installing big 3-sided prisms and working with light and creating these images of rainbows.
And David Batchelor, who was actually a guest on the podcast in an earlier episodes, you can listen to him talking about the fear of colour if you would like to. But he's also done a lot with light and
I've got
rainbows
a lot of time.
as well.
Yes, absolutely. It's one of the best books on colour ever written, Chromophobia. And David, also an artist, he works a lot with colour or with transparent materials that sort of emanate colour or let light through. So it's recently been working with plastics, but he's also been collecting colour or old light boxes, old neon signs, anything so found in the streets of cities, and then reassembles them and lights them up again in a museum context.
Lots of nice things for people to look up there, explore how rainbows have been represented. But I guess we need to ask why there has been such a fascination, I guess, with rainbows through history. And really, we do need to go back into ancient mythologies to start that story. So rainbows have been this really colourful metaphor for the link between the mortal and the divine realms. So the Greeks have a messenger goddess called Iris, who personifies the rainbow. And her name has a double meaning, so it's connected with both the Greek word Iris, the rainbow, and Eris, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, messenger. And so she's connecting those two worlds. And there's a Celtic example that's quite similar, Alexandra, I think.
Oh, I don't know of a god or goddess, but I do know of Celtic. They're not discs. In German they're called Regenbogenschüsselchen, so rainbow bowls. And it's discs or little coins, indented coins, some decorated with wonderful imagery, Celtic imagery, predominantly found in Germany. And they were usually found near rivers or in riverbeds, and supposedly representing the end of the rainbow or having dropped from the rainbow. So that's what I know about Celtic mythology. But of course, yes, the Iris imagery and the goddess Iris, that's really prominent. And I know that in Goethe's house in Weimar, he has still there, image of a painting of Iris sitting on a rainbow on the ceiling.
Amazing. Very apt. And then I guess in Western culture, probably the one we're most familiar with now is the rainbow story of Noah's Ark from the Judeo-Christian tradition. And yes, is the quintessential rainbow story of the link between mortal and divine realms in this covenant story. Alexandra, I don't know if you want to
certainly. I think
listen.
Where we live is in our culture, that's probably the most dominant sort of association, certainly in the Judeo-Christian realm. And it is like most sort of celestial things, to put it very broadly, humankind have always been fascinated with what is up there in the sky. So the moon has a similar importance in human history, in mythology, but also science, because it was always both. Observing, understanding, what does the moon do? What's happening there? Why does it disappear? And how does the rainbow appear? And then applying it to mythology or religion or belief systems. So those sort of celestial events, they feature large in human history. And of course, the rainbow very, very closely related to sun imagery. And we see that in almost all cultures. What we don't have, of course, for these ancient cultures, many of the ancient cultures, is a sort of a written evidence or written tradition. So we rely on images and hope we're interpreting them correctly.
And of course, with the Bible, we do have the written tradition. So The Covenant with Noah is just a fantastic story, and I'm sure many children still taught it. But you get this great flood as judgment on the world from God, and it sort of sends the world back into this pre-creation water chaos state, reminiscent of the pre-creation Genesis story. And God makes a way for a restored creation that begins with Noah and his family. So Noah is given instructions to build an ark. And then as the flood subsides, God makes this formal promise, or what's called a covenant, to the people and all living creatures as well, never to flood the world again. And instead, he'll work to preserve the earth and bring salvation. So this promise to rescue humanity and creation through the offspring of the woman. And he gives this sign, which is the rainbow, as the unconditional promise of his faithfulness. And in the Hebrew, the word isn't rainbow as such, although it's describing a rainbow. It's a bow, literally from bow and arrow. And so you get this image of God hanging up his bow, putting down his weapon as such, and bringing peace. And then I think perhaps, that's the kind of Judeo-Christian story. In the Christian narrative, I think most people might not know that then the rainbow symbolism gets picked up in relation to Christ. So you get what Christians would see as a prophetic vision of Christ in the Old Testament book of Ezekiel. In chapter 1, you get the appearance of the bow that's in the cloud in the day of rain. So was the appearance of the brightness around, and then he sees this vision of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And then you get another vision in Revelation, which is the last book of the Christian Bible. And you get this vision of Christ sat on a throne, and there's a rainbow around it, in sight like to an emerald. And you get all of this, all of these color words going through that in Revelation. But I think that side of the story is less known, and it does get picked up by artists as well.
But is that quite? I mean, if effectively that is a very old sort of representation of the rainbow, but it's the notion of hope, because you've had the storm, you've had the rain, and it's a symbolism of the new, that sort of links to the representations of Christ. It's the new hope, and that's coming after what was bad before type thing. So it's quite, I expect that became quite fundamental in people's brains, and how that's kind of seen the rainbow as being the hope bit after.
Well, yes, because so the Noah covenant is the first of the 5 major covenants, and all of which are fulfilled in Christ. So all of those promises that get made, as Christians would believe it, obviously, get fulfilled in Christ's sacrifice. So that's the ultimate hope of renewal that the rainbow is originally a picture of. Yeah. Absolutely.
It's a very potent symbol, isn't it? Because it's got a clear shape. So it is the bow shape. Although, is that correct? And shouldn't it be a circle?
It's a circle, yes.
Yeah.
If you're up the top of a very tall mountain or in a plain, and the weather and the sun is in the right point, apparently you can see the full circle.
Really?
Yeah,
wow.
you can see the full circle, but it's all to do with being in the right place at the right time. But the bow is effectively how you see it, because normally and historically people will be standing on the floor. So it's the angles of such would be that you always see the arc of the rainbow.
And there are some religious images where Christ is sitting not under a rainbow or in a rainbow, but in a rainbow circle. There are some.
Yeah.
I think from the Renaissance era. But of course, what a great iconographical element that is in art, certainly in painting. I mean, it works so well as you can anchor things, you can frame things, people can sit in it or hold it even.
Yes. We don't have time to go into these 2 paintings, but there's also a tradition of kind of rainbow-coloured wings of angels. So you can look up Jan van Eyck's The Annunciation, which is in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, who we are often confused with. we are two different places. And Bermejo's St. Michael triumphs over the devil. There are some rainbow wings in that as well that we can't be totally sure, but we do think that those reference back to the Christian symbolism of rainbows. So perhaps go and have a look at those in your own time. Either you can zoom in on our websites or come and see them in person if you're in the right place. So yeah, that we've picked up on the kind of biblical symbolism, and we're going to head back now into the present day, I guess, or back into the 20th century. So rainbows have been kind of picked up a lot recently with political and social movements. So of course, the Pride movement is probably familiar to most listeners, and the colourful rainbow has been used to reflect diversity and sexuality. So it became the international symbol of the gay movement in 1978. There's an artist and drag queen called Gilbert Baker who created the first rainbow flag. And that's been used extensively to depict pride, defiance and hope. And it's sort of been redesigned over the years to better represent the breadth of the LGBTQ plus community. So, for example, in June 2018, designer and activist Daniel Kozar released an updated version of the Pride flag, which has a chevron pointing forward in addition to the traditional 6-colour flag. And that's called the Progress Pride flag. And then I'm sure we all remember the COVID-19 pandemic of starting in March 2020, and pictures of rainbows began springing up all across the UK in kind of windows of schools and homes where there were children in particular. I think teachers were encouraging children to paint these bright and cheerful rainbows to encourage the NHS, encourage key workers, bring a smile to people, signs of community togetherness, hope for brighter times.
After a storm.
After a storm, as Joe put it earlier. Did your kids do some rainbow painting in the pandemic? Yeah. I think it was pretty ubiquitous.
But that was the rainbow shape, was the bowl shape, wasn't it? So
yes.
And so there was some criticism from some other groups about taking over the pride symbolism.
So yeah, some LGBTQ activists were quite critical at the time, saying that using the rainbow to support the NHS kind of confused and watered down the symbolism for their community. So yeah, it wasn't totally universally positively received. But we can see, I guess, how the symbolism across both of those kind of more social or political uses of the rainbow have been linked back to this idea of hope, hope for the future. So now seems like a good time for us to take a break. We've had a good look at the symbolism of rainbows. And when we come back from the break, we are going to look more at weather, rainbows, atmospheric studies, and John Constable. So before the break, we were going through some of the history of symbolism of rainbows, and now we're going to dive in a little bit more to the kind of weather around rainbows and how they've been painted. So let's have a look at John Constable's Salisbury Cathedral from the Meadows, which was exhibited in 1831, and it's in the collection at Tate. And probably one of the most famous painting descriptions, depictions of a rainbow. Alexandra, I wonder if you might describe some of it to us and tell us about it.
Well, it's one of Constable's larger paintings. I'm not sure whether it's a 6-footer, but it is large, and it bothered him. He changed it several times, and I think in 1831 it didn't have the rainbow. So it's large. It shows us a view of Salisbury Cathedral from the meadows. There's cows and there's a dramatic sky which takes up sort of almost half of the painting, sort of diagonally arranged with very stormy, thick clouds. And there's the wonderful spire of the cathedral, and then there's the rainbow. So he comes into the painting on the left, from the top left, and then the end of the rainbow, possibly the pot of gold, is on a little house. And we know that's the house of one of John Constable's dearest friends, Mr. Fisher. And he added the rainbow later, I understand.
Very interesting. So yeah, we've got this large, very Gothic cathedral, haven't we? Taking centre stage, but almost overshadowed, I guess, by the rainbow. And there's trees and bushes around as well. The meadow's edged by this row of trees and buildings. And the sky does look quite ominous, doesn't it? There's a lot of sort of white clouds, but then also very deep and sombre grey clouds hanging over the cathedral, which for perhaps listeners in other countries is a small city in the southwest of England. Is there anything else you wanted to?
The light's quite stunning in it. In that it's
yes.
as you're saying, you've got very bright white clouds on one bit, very dark clouds, and the cathedral itself is picked out because the light is shining on one side of the cathedral. But then effectively that then starts to question the position of the rainbow based on where the sunlight is and where the rain is. So as we said right at the start, to be able to see the rainbow, you want the sun behind you.
Yes.
But when someone is looking, if you sort of image yourself in the viewer's position looking at this painting, the sun isn't behind you. The sun is shining from your right down towards the left to hit the side of the cathedral. So the rainbow has been positioned, as you mentioned, to highlight his friend's home. And it's rather than a accurate depiction of where a rainbow would have appeared in that view.
Okay.
But the rainbow itself is depicted quite nicely. But the positioning is interesting, shall we say.
Because he was known as a sort of amateur scientist, wasn't he, in terms of his interest in meteorology and atmosphere and weather.
Hugely interested in meteorology and attended lectures on clouds. I think he went to the lecture by Luke Howard on the classification of clouds here in London. Certainly knew about it, and he had the book by Thomas Foster on meteorological phenomena. So he was hugely interested, but also he grew up a miller's son in relatively flat countryside. So of course he was well aware what weather does, what happens next. So he was a great observer of the skies, and he considered the sky, I think he called it the chief sentiment of a painting or of a painting. So that's so the weather, the sky tells the story, what you see there. And what story is he telling here? Well, there is his usual take on, dramatic skies, but there's the added personal story of his friend who had just died and wanting to sort of commemorate him in the form of a rainbow, the most fascinating, the most colourful sort of phenomenon in the sky. So he adds it, and it's accurate to a certain point because it has to fit the story. So that's why it's not quite in the right place, but I understand otherwise it is correct. And we know he, more so than Turner, who was also a great observer, but in a much more sort of emotional, immediate sense. Constable made lots and lots of meticulous notes on atmospheric conditions. And so he had a sort of more academic approach, maybe, to this. And he sketched rainbows and other phenomena meticulously throughout his career, and quite often gets it right.
Very good to know. So we've looked so far just at single rainbows, but of course there is this phenomenon of double rainbows. What are they? How do they happen?
If we go back to what we talked about right at the start, about the light travels from the sun through the atmosphere and hits a raindrop. And it starts to bend in the raindrop and then reflects from the inside of the raindrop and comes out as the rainbow. If it bounces twice, so if effectively you have a reflection and then another reflection, you can then end up with a second rainbow.
Or even a third, potentially.
The issue is that because that's the second reflection, the second rainbow will be weaker. So if you started to have more and more internal reflections, you would get weaker and weaker and weaker. But also because it's a second reflection, the second rainbow is a mirror image of the first. So the order of the colours in the rainbow is the mirror image of the first rainbow. So they do look different.
And artists haven't always got this right, have they? So let's look at a painting by John Everett Millais from 1856, which is in Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery, called The Blind Girl. It's a painting that shows two young girls, we presume that they're sisters, who are resting on the side of the road on a grassy verge, both wearing clothes that are worn and patched, and that one girl on the left appears to be a bit older. She's wearing an orange skirt and has a red shawl draped over her head and flowing down to her waist. And she's got her eyes closed with her pale face turned upwards towards the sky, like she's soaking in the sun. And she's holding a music box in her lap and a sheet of paper around her neck on which we can read the words "Pity the Blind." And then the other girl sits to her right, leaning back into her older sister's side, and she clutches her sister's hand. Her left hand pulls on her sister's shawl around her and across her face, and she's wearing a black or grey long sleeve top and a blue skirt. Her blonde hair goes down, reaches just her shoulder, and she's turned to face the right hand side of the painting, so we can only see one side of her face. And behind the girls is a bright green grassy meadow going back into the distance, and in the background, in the top quarter of the painting, there's a village flanked by dark, dark rain clouds with a double rainbow arching overhead in the centre of the sky. So what was Millais doing in this painting, Alexandra, and what did he get wrong?
Well, Millais was one of the pre-Raphaelites, of course, and it should be noted that they were this group of artists and their followers were particularly interested in luminosity, in very bright jewel-like colours,
yes,
and good pigments, of course. I think some of them used George Field's pigments, great colour man. So naturally, they tried to paint very sort of bright and luminous pictures, and it's no surprise that Millais picks up here on the subject of the rainbow, but also sight and light and the sun, of course. There's the blind girl who is unaware of the beautiful double rainbow behind her. So little sister is, of course. She's craning her neck to see the double rainbow. She's sitting extremely still because there's the butterfly who's resting on her shawl. But so it's obviously a comment on hope again, but also the ephemeral nature of these phenomena and what you can and cannot see. That's how
almost
I interpret
an allegory of the senses.
Yeah, it's all about the senses, and that's why the butterfly is there, and it's extraordinarily luminous countryside, which she can't see, but she can still feel the warmth of the sun, of course. But what about the rainbows? Are they accurate as you see them, Joe?
The picture I'm looking at here, it looks quite good. So you've got the red, the main dominant rainbow, and you've got the red going through the violet, and then the one above it goes the other way. So you've got the red and then goes through to the violet that way.
And
around.
It's slightly paler, so that's
it
all fine. But
yes.
when Millais first painted it, someone pointed out that he got that one wrong. So,
yes. So it's correct now, but he had to repaint it.
He had to repaint it, and I don't think that would have happened to Constable. In fact, it didn't. But clearly he uses the rainbow quite accurately, but not entirely accurately. But this is an allegorical painting. It tells a story, and it's supposed to also trigger certain emotions. Of course, it's quite sentimental painting, and he takes on that criticism and thinks, okay, it needs to be accurate. So he goes back and
amends his mistake.
Yes. It's a still phenomenal painting. But of course, Constable gets it right, because we also get double rainbows from Constable.
Very good. So we've talked about artists kind of painting with colours in the visible spectrum. What's the prismatic palette, Alexandra, and how does that relate to kind of impressionist and post-impressionist work?
Well, the so-called prismatic palette, and we're talking physical palettes now. We're talking about what an artist uses. So we're doing what Kaufmann did. We're taking the colours from the rainbow and putting them on a palette. So how do you do that? How do you paint light? And there were all these great ideas floating around in the later 19th century, aided by the availability of ready-made pigments that you could just buy in a tube with collapsible tubes with little sort of screw tops, so less messy, but also it allowed you to be a lot more experimental and work quicker and capture fleeting images. And fleeting images have a lot to do with the weather, atmospheric conditions and light conditions. So the Impressionists were really the trailblazers in that, but it continues and it remains a theme in art, how to capture something ephemeral, how to capture light. But especially sort of in the later 19th century, Impressionists like Seurat, like Sisley, had this idea of only painting with chromatic colors, shall we say, so the pure colors, and not use black, and only ever mix those ready-made colors, which you then squeeze onto your palette, with white.
Okay, so chromatic colors being everything except black,
and browns and whatever. So just stick to, don't mix, avoid mixing. Just if you must mix your color with something, mix it with white, and everything else happens on the canvas. It's a great idea, but a lot of the artists realized quite quickly they also needed black to cut through certain things or to achieve certain effects. But
yes,
it's a great idea, and palettes survive where you see that layout. I think Seurat wrote a lot about it, but also physical palettes survive where he does just that. He lays out the colors and then he mixes them with. Then there's a blot of white, and then he shows us the mixtures with the white, basically lightening.
We will conclude our episode with a Seurat painting in our collection, actually. But before we finish there, Jo, we've talked about palettes of colours on, artists' palettes that aren't in the rainbow. But there are also non-spectral hues, aren't there? So colours that aren't in the rainbow more generally.
It's one of these things called a non-spectral colour. I mean, if we're talking about the rainbow, it is a visible representation of the spectrum of light. So going across from red to violet. Now, if you go across that rainbow, as we were saying before, there's not just 7 colours. You can zoom in on lots of different bits, which are the blends between these different colours. And you get lots of different hues or shades. Well, not shades, but lots of different sort of colours between them. But there are other colours we use in life which cannot be represented by a single wavelength in the rainbow. You can't just take a slice in the rainbow and get all the colours. And the most sort of common one of that is probably magenta. So magenta is always a mixture of red and blue. I mean, there's obviously a whole range of different mixtures of red and blue you can get, but you can't represent that with a single wavelength of light. So this is why it's called a non-spectral colour. I mean, you have other non-spectral colours. I mean, brown is obviously a non-spectral colour. You get that by mixing lots of other colours. But the magenta is the one that it's the strongest example of it. And there are others, greeny blues and things, which also come out. But yeah, magenta is a non-spectral colour.
So we get that from our perception, blending different colours.
Yes,
together.
Because you see the red bit and you see the blue bit, and then your brain sees them both mixed, and you get the purpley colour.
And then we can go beyond the visible spectrum in another way, can't we? Into non-visible light.
Yes. So it's quite important for museums and galleries. Technically speaking, the electromagnetic spectrum covers all things from radio waves at one end to gamma rays at the other. All we're doing is we're changing the energy of the rays, or the wavelength as well. It's to do with how the energy is composed. But from a gallery point of view, obviously we are very interested in the visible light. It's what you can see. But on one side, you have infrared, which is where things start to get warmer. And on the other side, you have ultraviolet light, or UV light, where there's a higher energy. So the UV light is effectively what affects your skin when you start to get tanned. And it can also start to affect different materials in paint and pigments, and it affects varnishes and various other things, can speed up the degradation. So from a museum's point of view, generally in the galleries, you'd like to remove the UV because we don't see it. And then we actually take out the heat as well, because that paintings can respond. Now, there's a slight difference because the National Gallery has very traditional paintings in it generally. Some paintings are deliberately made of materials that are meant to hit with UV. So effectively, if you hit some materials with ultraviolet light, they will then give off visible light. They fluoresce. So certain modern pigments and modern materials, there is supposed to be some aspect of UV light in its presentation, because then it looks different.
So they would look rather less exciting on the walls in
Yes.
the National Gallery than, well, obviously if we displayed them,
That's the idea.
we
If
would
it was part
change
of the
the
work
light
of art,
source.
you
But
would need to have some kind of UV component. I mean, fluorescent lights is the good example of that. You have materials in the light which fluoresce when you hit with higher energy light, and you get visible light coming out. The other thing is within the conservation work within the National Gallery, UV light, and many galleries around the world, UV light is actually used as an inspection tool. Because if you shine UV light on natural varnishes, they will actually fluoresce greeny blue or salmon pink, depending on what the materials are made of. So if you're very careful about this, you can use them to then show you where the varnish is thicker on the painting. If you were cleaning off an old degraded varnish, you can see where those patches of varnish remain, and that helps with the cleaning process. But you do need to be quite careful because the UV is bad for your eyes. So you can't be sitting there with a UV lamp. It's basically, the painting doesn't like too much UV and you don't like too much UV. So you have to be very careful when you're working with ultraviolet light.
so officially ultraviolet and infrared are sort of in the rainbow, we just can't see them.
Yes.
Okay.
Some creatures can, I understand.
Yes.
You know, birds can see
Some
whether we've got
creatures
sun cream on.
And bees, I think, can see
Some.
ultraviolet.
The
Someone
thing
said earlier in, in an episode.
The thing you do have to remember, though, is that the light coming from the sun will have a lot of this electromagnetic spectrum in it, but a lot of it is then removed by the atmosphere that it's passing through.
Okay.
So certain aspects of ultraviolet light that you can create won't necessarily hit you if you're standing there because of the atmosphere, unless there's a big hole in the atmosphere, and that can result in different or larger amounts of ultraviolet light coming through. So
Right.
that's a lot of discussions in the past of holes in the ozone layer can
Yeah.
result in more intense exposure to ultraviolet light, or the types of ultraviolet light that might hit you.
And we've only really been talking about natural light, which of course breaks into the rainbow as we see it in the sky. But synthetic light sources work a bit differently, don't they?
Yes, yeah. So you would normally describe natural light as what's called a broad spectrum light source. It contains the whole rainbow, basically, at roughly equal amounts. Now, to make artificial lights, that's not always the case. I mean, the most traditional light is obviously flame, and that's quite a warm light. And then if you look at tungsten bulbs, which we used for many years, that's quite a warm light again. Now, when we start moving into more very sort of common ones now, they're LEDs. You don't have one thing that is warmed up and gives off light. I mean, the sun warms up, it gives off light. Tungsten filament in a bulb, you put electricity through it, it warms up and it gives off light. Within an LED, traditionally, you would have one blue light and then what's called a yellow phosphor. And the blue light would excite the yellow phosphor, and the combination of the two of them would give you white light. But if you put that through a prism, you wouldn't then get an even rainbow because you're only making it up from the strong blue and strong yellow component. So it doesn't work. Although it looks fairly good because they're designed to appear correct, if you started generating rainbows from LEDs, you would see different rainbows depending on how the LED was made up.
So we think of rainbows as one fixed thing in nature, but artificially speaking, rainbows could be many different things.
You would be changing the intensity of the colour, so it would look different depending on the LED, yes.
Fantastic, thank you. So we're going to end, as I said, by looking at George Seurat very quickly, because we're going to answer our audience question. So thank you for the person on YouTube who sent in this question, which is, where can we see rainbows in the National Gallery's collection? And we don't have all that many, but there is a lovely study done for bathers at Asnières in 1883 by George Seurat, which has a lovely rainbow in it. And in the bottom left of the painting, we've got a grassy riverbank which slopes down towards the bottom corner of the landscape. You've got three figures sitting on the bank, looking out across the river. And they're not sort of sat next to each other, these figures. They're spaced out left, centre and on the right. And then in the distance, we have buildings, trees stretching across the horizon line and some black barges on the river. And then in the sky beyond, you've got our lovely rainbow, which curves upwards from the left of the horizon line towards the top centre of the painting, across a backdrop of a pale blue sky. Alexandra, talk to us about Seurat.
Well, it's lovely that this is now on display in the National
Yes.
Gallery. And, people talk about all these beautiful things in the new rehang, but this for me is one of the absolute gems. So you have the very famous Bathers painting, which is huge. And then you have several of the sketches that preceded the painting, and they're quite small. And of course, the rainbow does appear in the sketch, but not in the big painting. So why did he put it in there? And is it accurate? So I'm going to have to hand over to Joe again. Is this an accurate rainbow?
It looks nice. When you start looking a bit closer, it's almost more 4 colours. It's kind of red, yellow, green, and a sort of a purpley blue there. But looking at the painting, you see a rainbow. Your brain just tells you it's a rainbow. And unless you start looking at it closely, you wouldn't worry about it. You just see the rainbow.
Yeah.
But it does appear to be more 4 colours, or in certain places almost 3.
Yeah, I tried counting yesterday, and I think I said 3 or 4. So
yeah,
it's a nod to a rainbow, but then it is a sketch.
Yes.
It is a sketch. And I don't think it's in quite the right place. If you look at the light again, it's sort of an afterthought. Now, I understand it was painted over the sketch is not really finished, but I think it was added last.
Yeah, so it was painted after the rest of the paint had dried for the sky.
It literally goes over the sky, which is already there. And it's a little bit ambiguous where the light is coming from, but I think he's again playing with this sense of, okay, here's a rainbow, and it's perhaps more of a symbol than an absolutely accurate rainbow.
Because you've got scattered clouds behind it rather than a rain clouds. It's kind of, there isn't an indication there would still really be rain coming there.
And I think the light's coming from here,
right,
from the right. And so it's there as a lovely iconographical element.
Yes.
It looks pretty. And of course, it taps into all these ideas. And Seurat was very interested in colour theory and light theory. I think he read Charles Blanc, amongst others, and then decides not to include it in the in the big work, of course.
There's almost that slight interesting with the arc as well, because there's a very faint, what appears to me, I don't know this in the description of the painting, I'm just looking at the picture now, almost potentially a factory or some kind of buildings in the far distance, and there appears to be smoke coming out at a similar curved arc to the rainbow.
Interesting.
Again, so you may have been playing with the curves, basically.
Playing with the curves, or maybe sort of man-made phenomena, smoke, and then the natural phenomena. Perhaps we're sort of interpreting this. But it's lovely seeing it, and you can see that, and then you look up and you see the finished work, and you can sort of follow his ideas.
So come to the National Gallery, decide for yourself why you think in the sketch Seurat did a rainbow and in the final painting he did not. So that brings us to an end of this episode, this final episode of our first series of Stories in Colour. Thank you so much, Alexandra and Joe, for all of your fantastic insights on rainbows. And we would really love to hear what you think of the podcast. If you could take 5 minutes to fill out our short survey, it will make future episodes even better. So yes, we do hope to be back. You can find the survey on our website. So that's nationalgallery.org.uk/podcast. And it's also linked below for you in the show notes, if that's easier. And as ever, if you've got more questions about the story of colour and how this amazing technology has interacted with human history, you can email us. We're on podcast@nationalgallery.org.uk, or you can send us questions via our social media channels. Just mention the podcast, and hopefully we'll be back for you and we can answer some of those questions in another series of Stories in Colour. So thank you again to our guests, Dr Alexandra Loske and Joe Padfield. I've been your host, Beks Leary. Our producer was Harry Rosehill. Our researcher was Hannah Rogers. Our technicians were Ian Warren and Tom Gulliver. Our video editor was Jean Canyon, with huge thanks to the whole scientific team at the National Gallery. And thank you ever so much for listening.